The Iranian paper that we looked at in part 2 included a spreadsheet of the ages of the different bloodlines in the different regions. But I'm going to put that aside for now because those ages are too old. But the ages of those bloodlines relative to each other, especially when we throw in the archaeology, are going to go a long way to proving the Romans are from Crete. But first I have to prove we were not in Europe in the Stone Age, not in large numbers anyway, although we did start trickling in about 6500 BC. That's how I know these ages are too old. Then I'm going to toss around a couple of ideas as to why I think these ages are wrong. First, we're going to start with an entry in Enoch's anthropology blog. The reason why this is important is because if my people are present in large numbers in Europe before the 13th century BC, then my case will be dramatically weakened. Lucky for me, we're getting a lot better at pulling DNA out of the bones of Stone Age people, and these bones are backing me up 100%. Contrary to what you read over and over again on the internet, J2a men in Europe like me are not the descendants of Neolithic farmers in Europe. Here's the famous Y-Chromosome the Iceman from northern Italy you might have heard of. He's included in the DNA samples. And here are some of the DNA results from just a couple of years ago. What you're looking for is a West Asian component. We're the West Asians. Y-Chromosome has a paltry 1.4%. There's no West Asian at all in Sweden, and none in the Spanish sample. The hunter-gatherers are virtually all Atlantic-Baltic. The farmers are a combination of Atlantic-Baltic and Southern. Now let's look at modern populations. Northern Italians, about 14%, 10 times as much. Lily-white Sweden, almost 10%. I think we Minoans had a colony up there, but I haven't been able to follow up on that. Some people swear we made it to Michigan, where we got copper. If we did, a colony in Sweden makes sense. We're about 5% in Spain, confirming West Asians like me and Neolithic farmers are two distinct races. And all of these people still have the old Atlantic, Baltic, and Southern components. The original inhabitants weren't genocided, although as we'll see later on, they briefly retreated. Looks like in the end we all came to terms with each other. But there are still a few pockets of almost pure original Europeans. Here are the Spanish Basque, who have a tiny bit of West Asian, like Y-Chromosome, but that could have come in much later. And the French Basque, who have none. But since we're getting so fantastic at pulling out old DNA, this latest report has an even greater variety of samples. And guess what? We are just showing up in Europe. Where I expect us to, when I expect us to, and the amount I expect us to. Ancient human genome suggests 3 ancestral populations for present-day Europeans. 4. This survey doesn't include us, although it does hint at our presence. Here we have those early European farmers everyone keeps trying to throw us in with. They cluster with the Sardinians. And here are the Western European hunter-gatherers. And here we are way up here. As you can see, we have nothing to do with any of these people. The next paper is talking about these people here. You can see we have a thin connection with them, and that will be important. Just as an FYI, there's a theory that white people made it to the New World before the Indians. Some people think this because some of the tribes looked almost white. This is probably why. These ancient North Eurasians are the ancestors of both the American Indians and many white Europeans. Some went east across the Bering Strait into Alaska, and some went west into Europe. Massive migration from the steppe is a source for Indo-European languages in Europe. Another gem. This paper talks about the DNA evidence that the Western group I just bracketed are descendants of the Yamna and early Maykop cultures that existed just north of the Caucasus Mountains. And it looks like they're right. Some scholars suspected Maykop influence in Anatolia, here at Alaka-Hayuk, but that has not panned out at all. The resemblances between Alaka-Hayuk and the Trans-Caucasian sites and horizons, such as Maykop, Medeni, Martkopi, and Trialeti, is often restricted to single objects rather than complete assemblages, and in many cases the assemblages compared are not from the same time period. For example, the tomb inventory of Maykop, which has often been compared to that of Alaka, contains only objects that bear a superficial resemblance to one object from Alaka in a much larger assemblage of goods. Further, Maykop is now dated to about 3700 to 3400 BC, more than 1,000 years earlier than Alaka-Hayuk. A lot of people insist that this group or somebody like them made their way down to Anatolia and brought the Indo-European language with them. But saying that over and over again is not going to budge the mountain of evidence against it. If anything, we influenced them. Remember, the M67s and the M530s migrated up to the Caucasus Mountains. That's why I pointed that out when we were looking at the maps in part 2. And the archaeology I'm going to be picking through backs that migration up, as well as our migration into Europe. Here's a tiny preview of that. Here you see the paper on the Yamnaya goes way deep into the Old Stone Age, the Paleolithic, all the way up to the Iron Age. That's early Rome. Here's Oetzi the Iceman again. You can see he's got a lot of company now, though nothing from the European Mediterranean. I predict we will find our West Asian blood there, just not a lot of it. A Swedish farmer from his time. Here we have 4 samples from Spain from right before his time, and 1 sample from Germany, contemporaneous with them. Now 3 Swedish hunter-gatherers from right after his time, and 4 samples from the corded ware culture. This culture was clearly established by the invaders from the Russian steppes. These are the ancestors of the majority of men in Europe. Here's how we know that's true. R1a and R1b are the most common haplogroups in many European populations today, and our results suggest that they spread into Europe from the east after 3000 BCE. 2 hunter-gatherers from Russia included in our study belong to R1a, Karelia, and R1b, Samara, the earliest documented ancient samples of either haplogroup discovered to date. These 2 hunter-gatherers did not belong to the derived lineages M417 within R1a and M269 within R1b that are predominant in Europeans today. But all 7 Yamnaya males did belong to the M269 subclade of haplogroup R1b. Here's the dynamic. Our results support a view of European prehistory punctuated by 2 major migrations. First, the arrival of first farmers during the early Neolithic from the Near East, and second, of Yamnaya pastoralists during the late Neolithic from the steppe. Our data further show that both migrations were followed by resurgences of the previous inhabitants. First, during the Middle Neolithic, when hunter-gatherer ancestry rose again after its early Neolithic decline, and then between the late Neolithic and the present, when farmer and hunter-gatherer ancestry rose after its late Neolithic decline. The second resurgence must have started during the late Neolithic Bronze Age period itself, as the Belbeker and Unetici groups had reduced Yamnaya ancestry compared to the earlier corded ware, and comparable levels to that of some present-day Europeans. Today, Yamnaya-related ancestry is lower in southern Europe and higher in northern Europe. Further data are needed to determine whether the steppe ancestry arrived in southern Europe at the time of the late Neolithic Bronze Age, or is due to migrations in historical times from northern Europe. Because the last bunch of Anatolians started moving into Europe about 600 years after they did, and then in large numbers a couple of hundred years after that. We had several clashes with their descendants. The final straw with us was when they sacked Rome in 390 BC. They were attacking the Greeks too. That's when we started our road to empire, which is why today a map of J2a men looks like a map of the Roman Empire. Many of the Indo-European languages you see today also came from the Yamnaya migration. Our results make a compelling case for the steppe as a source of at least some of the Indo-European languages in Europe by documenting a massive migration around 4,500 years ago associated with the Yamnaya and corded ware cultures, which are identified by proponents of the steppe hypothesis as vectors for the spread of Indo-European languages into Europe. Now, as I said, there's good evidence that we influenced the Yamnaya culturally and genetically. That actually shows up in this paper's DNA data on the Yamnaya. They just didn't zero in on it. Obviously, I'd be very interested in a follow-up. The Yamnaya differ from the Eastern hunter-gatherers by sharing fewer alleles with MA1, suggesting a dilution of ancient North Eurasian ancestry between 5000 and 3000 BC on the European steppe. This was likely due to admixture of EHG with a population related to present-day Near Easterners, as the most negative F3 statistic in the Yamnaya, giving unambiguous evidence of admixture, is observed when we model them as a mixture of EHG and present-day Near Eastern populations like Armenians. Now, as you saw in my survey of the Armenian genocide, the Armenians are our neighbors. Okay, what I'm about to read you is confusing, so let me walk you through it. You have Eastern hunter-gatherer DNA. You mix it with Western hunter-gatherer DNA and farmer DNA from Europe, from the early and middle Neolithic. Do these people look like late Neolithic Europeans? No. You take that same European DNA, you mix it with Yamnaya DNA. Do these people look like late Neolithic Europeans? Yes. Why? Because the Yamnaya are the result of Eastern hunter-gatherers mixing with people from the Middle East. People who have nothing to do with the original European farmers. They mixed with people who had already mixed with us. And this is probably how the Indo-European language made its way from us to the Yamnaya, through culture, not conquest. And then the Yamnaya spread the Indo-European language into Europe, through conquest. To distinguish whether a Yamnaya or an EHG source fits the data better, Eastern hunter-gatherer, we added ancient samples as outgroups, adding any early or middle Neolithic farmer results in EHG-related genetic input into early Neolithic populations being a poor fit to the data. Thus, late Neolithic populations have ancestry that cannot be explained by a mixture of EHG and middle Neolithic. When using Yamnaya instead of EHG, however, we obtained a good fit. These results can be explained if the new genetic material that arrived in Germany was a composite of two elements, EHG and a type of Near Eastern ancestry different from that which was introduced by early farmers. So once again, my race isn't descended from the first European farmers who got beat up by later invaders. So cut it out. It's okay if we were. Every race has gotten stomped a time or two. I'm sure the Yamnaya invasion of Europe was as spectacular as the Aryan invasion of India several centuries later. But for now, I'm going to go back to the Iranian paper and talk about our own entry into Europe, which was very quiet and unspectacular. I'll start with the Anatolian Pioneers, the M530s. The first place the M530s show up in Italy is in Apulia, the heel. Remember Apulia, because this early settlement is exactly what the archaeological record will show. They next moved to Sardinia and Bulgaria at about the same time. Bulgaria is the Karanovo culture I talked about when we were looking at the map. Probably. Not 100% on that, but the location is perfect. Then they moved to the coast of the Balkan Peninsula. So it's just like we saw on the map, an east to west movement. Then it looks like some of them settled in Lebanon, probably directly from Anatolia. Then finally Calabria, the toe of the boot of Italy. I don't know why they were so slow to colonize that area. Might have been better opportunities elsewhere. We're not talking about big populations here. So let's recap. When we look over the archaeology, we'll see that this M530 movement exactly matches the appearance of Neolithic artifacts in Italy, France, and Spain. So this is a perfectly good Neolithic migration. But notice, nobody's moving into central Italy. That also shows up in the archaeology. So now we're moving on to the M67s. Once again, this is the parent clade of my people. This is when things start getting weird. Okay, so first they pop up in Cyprus. That makes sense. It's right off the coast of southern Anatolia, their homeland. Then they show up in central Italy, before they show up in Crete, in Sicily and Sardinia, before they show up in Greece, and then the Balkans. Throw in the fact that they're popping up all at once in central Italy when nobody else wanted to live there for thousands of years, and you've got a mystery. So now to recap this cockeyed migration. Now onto my people, the M92s. As I said, we're a subclade of M67s. Boom. Central Italy first. Before Greece, long before Crete, then Sardinia. Well, at least Sardinia is reasonable, not to be confused with believable. Now the recap of this second cockeyed migration. When I first saw these numbers, I'd already drawn my conclusions from the archaeology, and this contradicted them. But obviously I have a dog in the fight, and my conclusions can be seen as convenient. The numbers are clear. We were in central Italy up to 12,000 years ago. The M530s were in southern Italy 20,000 years ago. The problem is, we were one of the engines that drove the Neolithic, and central Italy is spectacularly barren of Neolithic artifacts. Spectacular because everywhere else has plenty of them. And then there are the unrealistic population movements these numbers imply, which I've just shown. So all the new Stone Age DNA that's been pouring in since my series on the Festus disk has clinched the argument in favor of a Bronze Age migration of my race. I was going with that anyway, but this lets me do it free of any nagging doubts. So let's use these numbers the way we really can, to show us which tribe of Anatolians entered Italy in which order. Using relative dates, it's a safe bet the M530s migrated to Italy first. The average date of entry is more than 13,000 years ago. That's ridiculous. So we'll check out the latest possible date according to the average margin of error, and that's about 9,500 years ago, about 7,500 BC. But that's still too early if you go with the archaeology. I put it at 6,500 BC in Apulia. Remember, 6,500 BC, Apulia. The M67 show up on average about 10,000 years ago, still ridiculous, by no less than 7,300 years ago according to the margin of error, 5,300 BC. Probably still a little too early, but not impossible for a stray sailor or two, although we'd have to call this guy a rower, because they use canoes, not sailboats. My people show up almost 8,000 years ago according to this. Obviously wrong. No later than about 4,000 years ago by a margin of error, 1850 BC, that might actually be spot on. It's then or a little after that we Cretans started building colonies in Italy. So what went wrong? Central Italy certainly, but southern Italy in the case of the M530s. Well, let's think about this. A larger variety of DNA implies people have been living at a spot longer, because they've had chances to rack up more mutations. But what else can cause a large variety of DNA? How about a sudden and dramatic migration? What if several thousand M67s and M92s suddenly started pouring into central Italy, say about 35 centuries ago? Would that cause so much variety? Sure it would. I'll show you why that happened later. The blogger Enoch gives us another explanation as to why these ages are too old. The age estimates are the result of using the inappropriate evolutionary mutation rate, and become even older because of the inclusion of the DYS388 marker that is very stable in many haplogroups, but very mutable within haplogroup J. I told you we were the children of Proteus. Even our DNA is slippery. I think that's awesome. So now we're done with DNA from the past. Next part, we're going to look at DNA in present-day Europeans, with a special focus on Italy.